I don't want your money, Clara said, her voice steady, despite the trembling in her hands. I want to know one thing before I walk through that door. Are the rumors true? The man across the table didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at a storm they've already decided to weather, patient, unmoved, and completely unreadable. Which rumors? Ethan Callahan said quietly. And that was the moment Clara realized she had married a stranger. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Clara Whitfield married Ethan Callahan, she wore her mother's dress and carried no flowers. There was no celebration planned. No guests had been invited from her side. Her father stood beside her inside the county clerk's office with his hat pressed flat against his chest, and he didn't look at her once during the ceremony. Not once. He stared at the floor the entire time, the way a man stares when he knows he has done something he cannot take back, and has decided that looking away is the only mercy he can offer. Clara signed her name on the marriage certificate with a hand that did not shake because she had made a decision the night before. She had decided that if this was the life being handed to her, she would walk into it with her chin up and her eyes open. She would not give anyone, not her father, not this stranger, not the whispering town of Millhaven, Montana, the satisfaction of watching her break. Ethan Callahan signed beside her name without ceremony. His handwriting was clean and deliberate, the kind of signature that belonged to a man who had learned long ago that words on paper carried weight. He didn't say anything when it was done. He simply placed his hat back on his head, held the door open for her, and waited. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected him to walk out first. The ride to the Callahan Ranch took 2 hours by wagon, and Ethan drove it himself. He had brought no ranch hand, no chaperone, no one to fill the silence between them. Just the two of them, the wagon, the wide Montana sky pressing down overhead, and 30 miles of trail that wound through land so open and unforgiving, it made Clara feel very small and very alone. She watched him from the corner of her eye for the first hour, trying to reconcile the man beside her with the stories she had been hearing since she was 17 years old. The silent wolf of Millhaven. That was what people called Ethan Callahan. Not to his face, no one said much of anything to his face, but behind closed doors over supper tables in the general store, when his name came up in conversation. They called him the Silent Wolf because he moved through the valley, the way a predator moves through territory it already owns. Quiet, purposeful, dangerous in ways that were difficult to name. People said he had ruined a man once, a rancher named Deckert, who had tried to undercut Callahan's cattle prices and found his contracts canceled, his buyers suddenly unavailable, his entire operation quietly dismantled over the course of one winter. No threats, no confrontation. Just Ethan Callahan, doing business the way he always did, efficiently and without explanation. People said he had thrown a man off his property at gunpoint and left him to walk 8 miles back to town in a January freeze. People said he kept to himself because he didn't respect other people enough to pretend he cared what they thought. Clara's best friend Ruth had grabbed her arm 2 days before the wedding and said very quietly, so Clara's father wouldn't hear, "You don't have to do this. There are other ways." And Clara had said, "Name one." Ruth hadn't been able to. "Tata, you're staring," Ethan said. Clara turned forward immediately, heat climbing her neck. "I wasn't." "You were." He didn't say it with irritation. He said it the way someone states a fact, simple, undramatic. "It's all right. Most people stare when they think I'm not looking." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "And are you always looking?" "Usually." She wasn't sure if that was supposed to be reassuring or not. She decided it wasn't, and said nothing for the next 20 minutes. Then, because silence had never been something she tolerated. "Well," she said, "I want to understand the arrangement." "Which part of it?" "All of it." She kept her eyes forward, watching the trail. "My father told me what he told you was owed. He told me what you agreed to in exchange. He did not tell me what you expect from me specifically." Ethan was quiet for a moment. The wagon wheels turned. A hawk crossed the sky somewhere above them. I don't expect anything, he said finally. She turned to look at him then. She couldn't help it. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have. He glanced at her briefly, then returned his eyes to the trail. I need someone who can manage a household, keep accounts, deal with suppliers when I'm moving cattle. Your father said you're educated and capable. I took him at his word. That's all. That's all. Clara studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins firm but not rigid, like a man who understood how much pressure to apply and when to let go. She thought about what she'd been told, about the coldness, the ruthlessness, the reputation that preceded him into every room. People in town say you're not a good man, she said quietly. The muscle in his jaw shifted. People in town say a lot of things. Are they wrong? He considered the question for longer than she expected, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Some of them are, he said. Some of them aren't. And that Clara understood was going to be the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. The Callahan Ranch was larger than she had imagined, not just the land. The land stretched to the horizon in every direction, a rolling canvas of grass and timber that seemed too big to belong to one man. But the operation itself, the corrals, the outbuildings, the bunkhouses lined up along the eastern edge of the property, the smoke from a cookhouse, the sound of men working calling to each other across the yard, the smell of cattle and hay, and the particular kind of industry that comes from a place that runs like a machine. A woman was waiting on the front porch of the main house when the wagon pulled up. Short, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair pinned back, and an apron that had seen years of hard use. That's May, Ethan said. She keeps the house. She's worked here longer than I have. May came down the porch steps before the wagon stopped moving. She took one look at Clara and said, Lord above, she's young. May, Ethan said. I'm not criticizing, I'm observing. May turned a sharp, intelligent gaze on Clara. Can you cook? Well enough, Clara said. Can you ride? Yes. Keep accounts? Better than most. May looked at Ethan. She'll do, she said, and went back inside. Clara blinked. Ethan climbed down from the wagon, came around to her side, and held out his hand to help her down. She hesitated for half a second, not because she was afraid, but because she was surprised. She hadn't expected the gesture. She took his hand. It was calloused and dry and steady, and he released it the moment she was on the ground, as if the contact had been practical and nothing more. May will show you the house, he said. Your room is at the end of the hall. You'll have your own space. He paused like he was choosing the next words with care. I won't come in uninvited. Clara held his gaze. Thank you. He nodded, once picked up her travel trunk like it weighed nothing, and carried it up the porch steps. Her room was nothing like she'd feared. She had spent 2 weeks imagining a spare cold space, a cot and a hook for her dress, and nothing else, the room of a woman who had been acquired for function, not for comfort. But what May showed her into was a room that had been genuinely prepared. A wide bed with a patchwork quilt in blues and creams. A writing desk beneath the window. A small bookcase empty but waiting. A ceramic wash basin with a painted blue rim that someone had clearly thought was pretty. Clara stood in the middle of it and felt something shift inside her chest. Not gratitude exactly, not trust. Something more complicated, the particular confusion of finding kindness where you had steeled yourself for cruelty. He had it redone, May said from the doorway, watching her. Clara turned around. What? 3 weeks ago, when he knew you were coming. May's expression was impossible to read, somewhere between matter-of-fact and protective. He had the wallpaper taken down and the walls repainted, said it had been a storage room long enough. Clara looked around the room with new eyes. He didn't mention that, she said. No, May said. He wouldn't. The first week was a careful dance of two people trying very hard not to disturb each other. Ethan rose before dawn and was gone before she came downstairs most mornings. He returned at dusk, ate quietly, answered questions. May or Clara asked him with 2 or 3 sentences at most, and retreated to his study to go over accounts until the house went dark. He was never unkind. He was never demanding. He never raised his voice, never made her feel unwelcome, never looked at her with the cold appraisal she had been waiting for. He was simply absent. Present in the house but absent from it at the same time, like a man who had learned so thoroughly to take up as little space as possible that he had practically made an art of disappearing. Clara began to wonder if the silence was intentional, if keeping her at a careful distance was its own form of message. She tested it on the 4th day. She brought his coffee to the study instead of leaving it on the kitchen table. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She set the cup on the corner of the desk and looked at the papers spread in front of him. Columns of figures, ranch ledgers, what looked like a land survey. "You're managing the accounts yourself," she said. He looked up. "Yes, I can help with that." A pause. "You said you kept accounts." "My father's. For 4 years after my mother died. Suppliers' labor costs, feed pricing, the whole operation." She pulled the nearest ledger toward her, slightly just enough to see the structure. "You're categorizing feed costs under general supplies. You'll lose visibility on seasonal price variance." Ethan stared at her for a moment. Then he turned the ledger fully toward her. "Show me." That was how it started. Not with warmth or feeling, but with work, the one language that seemed to exist between them without misunderstanding. She took over the accounts by the end of the week. Not because he asked her to, because she asked him to let her, and he said yes, without hesitation, which was its own kind of trust. She began sitting at the desk in the evenings, while he reviewed the day's operations, and they would talk through numbers, discuss supply orders, argue mildly about whether it was better to negotiate prices at the spring market, or wait until summer when the demand shifted. He listened to her. He disagreed with her sometimes, and when she proved her point, he acknowledged it. Just a slight nod. But it was there. On the 9th night, Ethan paused over a particular column in the supply records and said without looking up, "You're better at this than I am." Clara looked up from the ledger she was updating. "I know," she said. And for the first time, just barely, the corner of his mouth moved. She told herself she was not warming to him. She told herself she was simply being practical. She told herself that finding a person tolerable to live with was not the same as trusting them, and that understanding a man's habits was not the same as understanding his heart. She told herself this particularly hard. The afternoon she found him in the far pasture crouched beside one of the older ranch hands, helping reset a fence post. The man's arthritic hands couldn't manage alone. They didn't know she was watching. Ethan was on one knee in the mud holding the post steady, while the old man tamped the earth around it, and he was talking to him in a low, unhurried voice. Not giving instructions, just talking. About the weather turning, about how the east pasture had looked when they first cleared it 10 years ago. About something the man's grandchildren had said that made the old man laugh and straighten his back, like he'd forgotten for a moment that it hurt. Clara stood at the fence line and watched and felt the first real crack appear in the wall she had built. She didn't say anything about it. She went back to the house and updated the supply ledger and told herself again that practical tolerance was not the same as anything more. But her handwriting was a little unsteady that evening, and she couldn't entirely account for it. "Who is Victor Hale?" She asked May the question on the 11th day after she'd found the name in 3 separate pieces of correspondence in the ranch files, always without a clear explanation, always prompting what looked like a careful, measured response from Ethan. May stopped rolling the bread dough she was working. She didn't turn around. "Where'd you see that name?" she said. "In the files. He's written to Ethan at least 3 times in the past month." May turned around then. Her expression had changed. The practical, no-nonsense steadiness was still there, but underneath it was something guarded, the way a person looks when a conversation has moved somewhere they were hoping it wouldn't go. "Victor Hale," May said carefully, "is the largest cattle operation in the southern part of the valley. He's been trying to expand north for 5 years. This ranch sits on the best water rights in the territory. If Hale controls this land, he controls every rancher in the valley." Clara heard what May wasn't saying. "And Ethan won't sell." Ethan will never sell. May turned back to her dough. Victor knows that. He's been trying to find another way. What kind of other way? May said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, the kind that doesn't look like a fight until it's already over. That night, Clara went through the correspondence more carefully. The letters were formal, professionally worded, the kind of polite that conceals its own threat inside perfect grammar. Victor Hale, requesting meetings. Victor Hale, extending offers. Victor Hale referencing unnamed concerns about certain past decisions that might require review if a continued business relationship was to be maintained. That last phrase made something cold settle in Clara's chest. She read it 3 times. Then she put the letters back exactly where she'd found them and went to find Ethan. He was on the porch, standing at the railing looking out over the dark. He heard her step and didn't turn around, but he didn't startle either. He had that quality she'd noticed of always seeming to know where people were without appearing to track them. "Victor Hale," she said. A pause. "You went through the correspondence. I managed the files. That's what you agreed to." She moved to stand at the railing beside him, a careful distance between them. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Ethan was quiet for long enough that the silence had weight. "No," he said finally. "He's not." "Then what's he planning?" He turned to look at her then, and in the low light from the house windows, she saw something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not fear, not anything as readable as fear. Something more exhausted than that. The expression of a man who has been carrying a particular weight for a very long time and has simply grown so accustomed to it that he no longer thinks of it as heavy. "That," he said quietly, "is what I'm trying to find out." Clara held his gaze, and she made a decision there in the dark that she was not going to wait to be told. That whatever Victor Hale was planning, she was going to know about it. And she was not going to stand behind this man while he faced it. She was going to stand beside him. She didn't say that out loud, not yet. But she went inside and opened the files again, and she worked until 2 in the morning, and when she finally went to bed, she knew 3 things she hadn't known at the start of the day. Victor Hale wanted the ranch. He had friends in the territorial government, and Ethan Callahan had been fighting him completely alone. On the 14th morning, a man came to the ranch that Clara hadn't seen before. He arrived on horseback fast and asked for Ethan by name without taking his hat off. Clara was on the porch when he rode up. She watched the man lean down from the saddle and speak in a low, urgent voice. She watched Ethan listen without changing expression, the way he listened to everything, like the words were being weighed, not just heard. When the rider left, Ethan stood still for a moment. Just stood there. Clara came down the porch steps. "What happened?" she said. He looked at her. Then, instead of giving her the 2-sentence version she had come to expect, he said, "One of my suppliers canceled. 30 head worth of feed contracts. Said he had a better offer." Clara understood immediately. Hale. Probably. He turned toward the barn. "I need to make some arrangements." "Ethan." He stopped. "This is what he does, isn't it?" She kept her voice steady. "He doesn't confront you. He takes away the things you need one at a time until the operation can't function." He turned slowly, studied her. "That's right," he said. "Then we document everything." She took a step toward him. "Every canceled contract, every supplier who pulls out, every letter he sends. We build a record, and when the time is right, that record is evidence." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like you've done this before," he said. "My father's neighbor tried the same thing to us 6 years ago," she said. "We beat him." The silence stretched. Then Ethan said very quietly, "I'll get you the files." And this time it wasn't just work between them. It was the beginning of something else entirely. A partnership neither of them had asked for, built in the space between fear and trust, forged out of necessity and mutual respect, in a land too hard and too beautiful for anything less than honesty. Clara didn't know yet whether she could trust this man with more than numbers. But she was starting to believe that the man everyone in Millhaven had spent years being afraid of was afraid of something too, and that it had nothing to do with Victor Hale. The files Ethan brought her filled half the writing desk. Not just Victor Hale's letters. Everything. 5 years of correspondence land surveys, water rights documentation, grazing agreements, supplier contracts. The entire paper skeleton of an operation that had been quietly under pressure for longer than anyone in Millhaven seemed to realize. Clara sat down in front of it all that evening and didn't move for 3 hours. May brought her coffee at 9 o'clock without being asked, set it on the corner of the desk, looked at the spread of papers, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "He's never shown anyone those files before." Clara didn't look up. "I know." Not his foreman, not his lawyer, nobody. May's voice was careful the way it got when she was saying something she wanted Clara to actually hear. "In 5 years, he's handled all of it alone." Clara set down the letter she was reading. She looked at the stacks around her, the sheer volume of it, the weight of one man carrying all of this in silence, managing every threat and every counter-move without a single person beside him, and felt something that wasn't quite pity, and wasn't quite admiration, but lived somewhere in between. "Why?" she said. May picked up the empty coffee cup from earlier and headed for the door. "Because the last time he trusted someone with the details of this ranch," she said quietly. "That person sold the information to Victor Hale." Clara turned around sharply, but May was already gone. She sat with that for a long time. Then she turned back to the files and worked until the lamp burned low. She found the first real piece of it on the third morning. Buried in a stack of old grazing agreements was a land survey from 1873, 5 years before the current dispute that showed a boundary discrepancy. A small one, barely a quarter mile. But the quarter mile in question sat directly over the main water channel that fed the north pasture. The survey Hale's lawyers had submitted to the Territorial Land Office showed a slightly different line. Not dramatically different, just different enough. Clara held the two surveys side by side and felt her pulse pick up. She went to find Ethan. He was in the far corral, working a young horse through its paces with a long lead. She stood at the fence and waited until he brought the animal around and saw her expression. He handed the lead to the nearest ranch hand without a word and came to the fence. "Look at these," she said, holding the surveys out. "I took them, studied them." His face didn't change, it rarely did, but she had been watching him long enough now to read the small signals, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set a degree harder. "Where did you find the original?" he said. "Bottom of the 1873 agreements, folded into the back of a grazing contract." "I've looked through those files 3 times. "You were looking for letters," she said. "I was looking for everything." He looked at her over the top of the survey. Something passed across his face, brief, unguarded, gone before she could name it. "This is the water rights dispute," he said. "This is how he plans to do it. He submits the altered survey to the territorial court," Clara said. "Claims the water channel falls on his side of the boundary. Your north pasture loses its water source. Without it, you can't run cattle on a third of your land. And without that land producing, the operation can't sustain itself." Ethan handed the surveys back to her. "He doesn't have to buy the ranch, he just has to make it unsustainable. And then buy it for a fraction of what it's worth." Clara folded the surveys carefully. "When does he file?" "I don't know." "Then we need to know." She looked at him steadily. "Do you have anyone at the land office?" He was quiet for a moment. "I did," he said. Before. She understood from May's words the night before what that meant. Before someone he trusted had stopped being trustworthy. "Then we work without one," she said. "But we get these surveys authenticated by an independent surveyor before Hale files anything. We establish the original boundary on record before his version becomes the only version." Ethan studied her. "You understand land law," he said. It wasn't a question. "My father fought a boundary claim for 2 years," she said. "I sat in on every meeting with the attorney. I read every document." She paused. "I told you I was useful." The corner of his mouth moved the way it had moved that first time over the accounts. Just barely. Just enough. "You did," he said. And then after a moment, "There's an independent surveyor in Helena. He's honest. I've used him before." "Write to him today," Clara said. "And Ethan." She waited until he looked at her directly. "Don't put the survey details in the letter. Just ask him to come. We don't know who reads the mail." He looked at her for a long beat. "All right," he said quietly, and she turned and walked back to the house, and she didn't let herself think about the way he'd looked at her just then, like a man who had spent so long doing everything alone that the simple presence of someone competent beside him was almost more than he knew how to absorb. His name was Danny Rourke, and he had been working the Callahan Ranch for 11 years. Clara met him the following week properly, when he came to the house to report a problem with the east fence line. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad across the shoulders, with an open, sun-weathered face, and the particular kind of easy manner that comes from a man who is genuinely liked by the people around him. The ranch hands respected Ethan, but they loved Danny Rourke. Clara had seen that in her first 2 weeks, the way they loosened up when he was near, how the tension of the workday broke when he laughed. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told Clara about the fence, and she listened and took notes and asked 3 questions he hadn't expected her to know, to ask about the post depth and the soil composition and whether it was single damage or a pattern. And by the end of it, he was looking at her the way people look when they've revised their opinion of someone upward. "You know ranching," he said. "I grew up on one," she said. "Not many women would ask about soil composition. Not many women have spent 4 years managing supply accounts for a cattle operation." She closed her notebook. "Get me the materials estimate by Friday, and I'll have the order in before the weekend." Danny grinned. It was the kind of grin that made the whole room slightly warmer. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it. After he left, May appeared in the doorway. "He likes you," May said. "He's being polite." "Danny Rourke doesn't do polite," May said. "He does genuine or nothing. You just got genuine." She paused. "That matters around here. The men follow his lead more than they'd admit." Clara considered that. "And Ethan, do they follow his lead?" May was quiet for a moment. "They follow Ethan because he's earned it," she said carefully. "Every promise he's ever made to those men he's kept. Every time someone's been in trouble, sick, hurt, a family problem, money, Ethan's handled it without being asked and without making a show of it." She looked at Clara steadily. "They'd walk into fire for him, but they don't know how to be close to him. He doesn't let them." "He doesn't let anyone," Clara said. "No," May agreed. "He doesn't." Chang. She started writing the property on the 17th day. Not because Ethan asked her to, because she needed to understand what she was working with, the physical reality of the land, the water sources, the pasture conditions, the distances involved. She needed it in her mind, the way she needed the numbers in the ledger, concrete and mapped. She borrowed a bay mare from the stable and went out in the early mornings before Ethan returned from his first round with the herd. She learned the ranch the way she learned everything, systematically paying attention, asking questions of anyone she came across. The ranch hands at first were uncertain of her. She could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she approached the careful, measured politeness of men who didn't yet know what category to put her in. Was she the boss's wife to be treated with formal distance? Was she someone temporary to be waited out? Was she going to interfere with the way things ran? She dealt with it the same way she dealt with everything. She made herself useful, and she made herself real. She stopped to help when she saw a problem she could contribute to. She remembered names and used them. She brought coffee out on cold mornings without making it a gesture, just did it efficiently as part of the day. She asked about their families when they mentioned them, and she listened to the answers, and the next time she saw them, she asked a follow-up question that proved she'd been paying attention. By the end of the 3rd week, the men had made up their minds about her. She knew it because Danny Rourke told her. He found her at the stable one evening as she was unsaddling the bay mare, and he leaned against the stall door and said without preamble, "They like you." "I know," she said. She pulled the saddle off and set it on the rack. "That's not a small thing," he said. "These are men who've worked hard all their lives and been treated like furniture by most of the people who've hired them. They notice when someone sees them as people." Clara turned to look at him. "So does Ethan." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah," he said. "He does. That's why they'd do anything for him. He paused. It's also why it's been hard to watch him spend 5 years fighting Hale alone. He won't ask for help. Acts like asking is weakness. It's not weakness, Clara said. No, Danny said. It's not. He pushed off the stall door, picked up his hat from where he'd set it on a post. Just so you know, the men would help if he'd let them. And I think maybe he listens to you more than he listens to most. He walked out, and Clara stood in the stable for a moment, with her hand resting on the mare's neck, thinking about what Danny had said and about what it meant. Then she went back to the house and went to find Ethan. She found him at his desk, but he wasn't working. He was sitting with his hands flat on the surface of the desk and a letter open in front of him, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness she had come to know. Something harder than that. Something that lived just below the surface of a man's composure when the thing he feared most has just become real. She stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. He seemed to come back from somewhere far away. "Hale filed," he said. 3 days ago. The Territorial Land Office received a formal survey dispute." Clara's hands went still at her sides. "Before we could authenticate the original. The surveyor from Helena is coming Friday." His voice was flat precise. "But Hale filed Monday. His version is already in the record." She crossed the room and held out her hand. He passed her the letter without hesitation, and she noticed that the absence of hesitation, the way he gave it to her without a pause, the way he now handed her anything relevant to the operation. As if the question of whether to include her had stopped being a question. She read it, twice. "He names a specific court date," she said. 6 weeks. "Yes. That's not enough time for a normal survey authentication process." "No." She set the letter down. "He planned it this way. He waited until he had a window, a specific window, where we couldn't counter fast enough through normal channels." "That's right." "Then we don't use normal channels." She looked at him. "Does your lawyer have a relationship with the territorial judge?" Something shifted in his expression. "Why?" "Because we don't need to win the case in 6 weeks. We need to get the case postponed. If we can get a 60-day extension, we have time to not only authenticate our survey, but to document the history of Hale's boundary claims and show a pattern." She picked up the letter again. "He's done this before, not to you, but somewhere. Men who operate this way always have a pattern." Ethan was very still. "How do you know that?" he said quietly. "Because the man who tried this against my father had done it to 2 other ranchers before us," she said. "And when our attorney found those 2 cases, the judge didn't just rule in our favor. He sanctioned the attorney who filed the fraudulent survey." The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of a man withholding something, but the silence of a man genuinely recalculating. "I'll contact my lawyer tonight," Ethan said. "And I'll start looking for prior claims," Clara said. "Victor Hale didn't build an operation that size without stepping on people. Someone has paper on it." She turned to leave. "Clara." She stopped, turned back. He was looking at her with that expression. She still didn't entirely have a name for the one that appeared sometimes when she said or did something he hadn't anticipated, something that required him to adjust whatever picture he'd been working from. "Thank you," he said, quietly, simply. She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when we win." She found the first prior claim in a week. A rancher named Aldous Crane, now deceased, who had filed a water rights complaint against Victor Hale in 1871 and had it dismissed, but the original filing was still in the territorial records, and the dismissed complaint described almost word for word the same boundary discrepancy that Hale was now using against Ethan. Same method, same argument, 7 years apart. Clara sat with that document in her lap and understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that they were not dealing with opportunism. They were dealing with a system, a methodology that Victor Hale had refined over years and multiple victims, designed to look like a legitimate legal dispute while functioning as outright theft. She brought it to Ethan at dinner. Set it on the table between them. He read it, put it down, looked at her. Aldous Crane lost his ranch, he said. In 1872, yes. Clara sat across from him. Because no one found this in time. You found it in 6 days. I knew what to look for. She paused. There are probably more. Hale's been in this valley for 15 years. I want to write to the land offices in 2 neighboring counties. I'll have my lawyer make the requests, Ethan said. He has standing that you don't. Good. Do it tomorrow. She hesitated, then said, Ethan, this is bigger than a boundary dispute. He's been running a systematic land acquisition scheme using fraudulent surveys for at least 7 years. If we can prove that, it becomes a federal matter, Ethan said quietly. Yes. And if it becomes a federal matter, Hale can't control the jurisdiction. No, he can't. She looked at him steadily. But we have to build the case before we escalate it. If we go to federal authorities now without documentation, it's just an accusation. He buries it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, When I was 22 years old, I came back from a cattle drive to find that a man named Grover Sills had filed a false contract claim against this ranch. He said my father had borrowed money and defaulted. My father never borrowed a cent from Sills in his life. His voice was level, but she could hear the thing beneath it, the years behind it. I spent 8 months proving it. By the time the case was dismissed, my father had died. The stress of it, the shame of people believing it. He looked at the document on the table. I swore I would never let someone use paper to take what was built with sweat and principle. I swore it. Clara said nothing. She understood in that moment that this was not a speech. This was the most he had ever said about himself to another person, possibly in years. She understood that it was a gift, even if he hadn't thought of it in those terms. Then we make sure they can't, she said. He looked at her. We document everything, she continued. We build the case file. We get your lawyer the extension. We find every rancher Hale has ever done this to. And then we don't just defeat him, we ensure he can never do this again. The lamp between them cast an unsteady light. Ethan reached across the table and picked up the Aldous Crane document, folded it carefully, placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket close to his chest, as if it were something precious. All right, he said. Outside, the Montana wind was picking up, pushing hard against the house walls, and the night stretched wide and dark and full of things not yet decided. Clara listened to it for a moment. Then she reached for her notebook and began writing the letter to the neighboring county land office, and Ethan sat across from her with his coffee and his silence. And for the first time since she'd arrived at this ranch, the silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like something shared. She wasn't sure when that had changed. She wasn't sure it mattered. What she knew was this: somewhere between the account ledgers and the land surveys and the story of a 22-year-old boy watching his father lose everything to a dishonest piece of paper. Clara Whitfield had stopped waiting to find out if her husband was a good man. She had already decided that he was. She just hadn't figured out yet what to do about it. The extension came through on a Thursday. Ethan's lawyer, a sharp, quietly aggressive man named Thomas Briggs, who operated out of Helena, had filed the postponement motion on a Tuesday and had it granted by Wednesday afternoon. 60 additional days. When Ethan told Clara at breakfast, she set down her coffee cup and let out a breath she had apparently been holding for 2 weeks. How did Briggs do it that fast? She said. He cited procedural irregularities in how Hale's filing was timestamped at the land office. Ethan passed her the telegram. Apparently, the filing was recorded at 4:47 in the afternoon. The land office closes at 4:30. Clara stared at the telegram. Then she looked up. He bribed someone at the land office to backdate the filing. That's what it suggests. Ethan, that's not just a boundary dispute anymore. That's fraud on a government document. I know. He picked up his coffee. Briggs is pulling the original time log. If the entry was altered, there'll be a trace. Clara sat back in her chair. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead, the way it moved when a problem clarified itself. That gives us 60 days and a potential fraud charge to work with. If Briggs can prove the filing was backdated, then Hale's survey is inadmissible and his entire case collapses, Ethan said. Yes, And we still have the Aldous Crane precedent. And whatever comes back from the neighboring counties. She pressed her hands flat on the table. We're not just defending anymore. We're building a case against him. Ethan looked at her across the table. That's exactly right, he said. And then quietly, you think like a lawyer. I think like someone who's watched a lawyer work, she said. There's a difference. Not as much as you'd think, he said. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered that didn't come attached to a specific task, and Clara felt it land somewhere unexpected. She picked up the telegram again and reread it carefully so that she had somewhere to look that wasn't his face. The letter from Bowman County arrived 4 days later. Clara was alone in the study when May brought it in, and she had it open before May reached the doorway on her way back out. She read it standing up. Then she read it again sitting down. Then she sat very still for a moment. Victor Hale had filed the water rights dispute in Bowman County in 1874. The rancher, a man named Silas Webb, had fought it for 14 months before losing a portion of his grazing land and selling the rest at a significant loss. The Bowman County Land Office had kept the full record, including the original survey. Hale had submitted a survey that an independent examiner had flagged at the time as containing anomalies in its boundary measurements. The examiner's note was attached. 2 sentences. Tucked into the back of a file that had presumably sat unread in a county office for 4 years. Clara brought it to Ethan the moment he came in from the range. He read it in the hallway, still in his work coat, and she watched his expression. Do the thing it rarely did, move through something complicated in real time too fast to fully contain. They flagged it, he said, 4 years ago, and nobody acted on it. Because Silas Webb lost and sold and left, Clara said. When there's no one left to fight, the file closes. How many files are closed because the people gave up? He said. It wasn't really a question. I've written to 4 more counties, Clara said. If the pattern holds, it'll hold. His voice had gone quiet in a particular way, the way it went when something made him angry, and he was choosing to absorb it rather than release it. This is what he does. He finds people who are already struggling, and he applies pressure in exactly the right place until they break. And then he buys the pieces. Ethan. She waited until he looked at her. When the responses come back from the other counties, and they will come back, we need to contact those ranchers. The ones who are still there. The ones who lost land but didn't leave. He was quiet for a moment. Why? He said. Because you're not the only one who has standing to make this case, she said. And because a federal examiner looking at one complaint from one rancher sees a dispute. A federal examiner looking at 7 complaints from 7 ranchers across 4 counties sees a conspiracy. The word landed between them and sat there. You want to organize them, he said. I want to give them the chance to fight back, she said. The same chance you're finally taking. She paused. Is that something you can do? Contact those men, get them in a room together. He studied her. Some of them won't trust me, he said. I've got my own reputation. Then I'll write the first letter, she said. Under both our names. He handed her the Bowman County document, slowly, deliberately. Write it tonight, he said. Victor Hale came to the ranch on the 28th day. He didn't send word ahead. He simply arrived mid-morning with 2 men behind him and had his horse brought up to the main house, like a man who considered it his prerogative to arrive wherever he wished without announcement. Clara was at the desk in the study when she heard the horses. She went to the window and looked out, and what she saw made something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly, she had been expecting something like this. But the physical reality of Victor Hale was different from the idea of him that she'd been building out of documents and second-hand accounts. He was older than she'd pictured. Late 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that came from long practice at being the largest presence in any room. He was not a tall man. He didn't need to be. He had the self-possession of someone who had spent decades ensuring that the world arranged itself around him, and it showed in every movement. May appeared at the study door. Should I get Ethan? May said. No, Clara said. I'll go out. May's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Clara smoothed her dress, picked up the small notebook she kept in the desk drawer, and walked out to the porch. Hale was already at the steps. He looked up at her, and she saw the brief recalculation pass behind his eyes. A woman alone, not what he came for. And then the practiced pleasantness settled back over his expression like a curtain dropping. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. His voice was smooth and warm, the way expensive whiskey is smooth and warm, carrying a heat that isn't real. "Victor Hale, I don't believe we've had the pleasure." "Mr. Hale," she said. She did not come down the steps. "My husband isn't available. I'm happy to wait. He'll be some time." She opened her notebook. "If you have business to discuss, I manage the ranch accounts and correspondence. You're welcome to state your business with me." Something moved behind his eyes. Quick, controlled, gone. "I appreciate the offer," he said in the tone of a man who did not appreciate it at all. "But this is a matter that requires Mr. Callahan personally." "My husband and I don't keep separate business matters," Clara said pleasantly. "Whatever you'd say to him, you can say to me." The two men behind Hale shifted slightly. Hale looked at her for a moment. A long moment, the kind designed to make a person feel they were being assessed and found lacking. Clara held his gaze without blinking. "You're from Montana, originally," he said finally. "Shifting approaches," she noted. "Your father is James Whitfield. Good man, good family. I hope he's recovering from his financial difficulties." It was a threat dressed in concern, and they both knew it. "My father is well," she said evenly. "Thank you for asking." Hale smiled. "Tell your husband I stopped by," he said. "Tell him I wanted to offer one more time a fair price for this land. Before things become—" He paused with the careful timing of a man who had rehearsed this. "More complicated." "I'll tell him," Clara said. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, rode out. Clara stood on the porch until they were well down the trail. Then she went inside and wrote down every word of the conversation, verbatim in her notebook, with the date and the time, and the names of the two men who had accompanied him. When Ethan came back in at noon, she handed him the notebook. He read it standing in the kitchen doorway. His face went very still. "He came here personally," he said. "He's rattled," Clara said. "The postponement rattled him. Men like Hale don't make personal visits when things are going according to plan. He threatened your father." "He referenced my father," she said. "He was establishing that he knows our pressure points. It was a message." She paused. "I want that visit in the case file. Time, date, witnesses." May was inside and heard the last part through the window. Ethan set the notebook down on the kitchen table, stood with his hands flat on the surface looking at it. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "Are you afraid of him?" She considered the question honestly. "I think he's dangerous," she said. "I think he's capable of things that aren't in those land office files. Yes." She paused. "But I'm not afraid in a way that changes what I'm going to do." Ethan looked at her. "Good," he said quietly. "Neither am I." The next twist came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. On the 32nd day, Danny Rourke came to the house before sunrise. Clara was already up. She slept less than she used to, the kind of restless alertness that comes from a problem that won't fully release its grip even in sleep. She heard the knock and came downstairs to find Danny at the kitchen door, his hat in his hands and his expression carrying something heavy. "Is Ethan up?" he said. "Not yet. What's wrong?" Danny came inside, sat down, looked at his hands for a moment. "I need to tell you both something," he said. "And I need you to know I'm telling you because of what I think is right, not because—" He stopped, started again. "I have a brother, younger than me. His name is Patrick. He's been working for Victor Hale for the past 8 months. Clara sat down slowly across from him. "I didn't know until 2 weeks ago," Danny said. "He didn't tell me. I found out from a mutual friend." He looked up. "Last week Patrick came to see me. He was scared. Said Hale had asked him to do something he didn't want to do." What kind of something?" Clara said. Danny's jaw worked. "Hale has a man on the inside at the Helena Land Office, a clerk named Purvis. Purvis has been adjusting filing timestamps and altering record dates for Hale for at least 3 years. He set his hat down on the table. Patrick was asked to deliver money to Purvis, cash payment for the work on Ethan's filing. The kitchen went very quiet. "Your brother delivered the payment," Clara said. "No," he refused. "That's why he came to me." Danny looked at her steadily. "But he knows Purvis's name. He knows the amount. And he saw the ledger. Hale keeps a private ledger separate from his business records. It lists every payment to Purvis going back 3 years, every case." Clara felt the blood move through her body in one long, slow rush. "Danny," she said carefully, "where is your brother now?" "At my place. He hasn't gone back to Hale's operation. Is Hale aware he refused the delivery?" "Not yet. Patrick told his foreman he was sick. He's bought maybe 3 or 4 days." Clara stood up. "I'm going to wake Ethan." She took the stairs at a pace she rarely used, knocked sharply on the study door. Ethan used it as a second sleeping room sometimes when he worked late. He was awake within seconds. She could tell from the sound of movement that he hadn't been deeply asleep. He opened the door, saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Get dressed," she said. "Danny's downstairs, and everything just changed." The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes while Danny told it from the beginning. Ethan listened in his particular way, completely still, completely attentive, not interrupting. When Danny finished, the silence lasted for 10 full seconds. Then Ethan said, "Patrick has to be protected before we do anything else." "Agreed," Clara said. "He can't go back to his rooms," Ethan said to Danny. "Hale will figure out he refused the delivery, and when he does—" "I know," Danny said. "He can stay with me, but my place isn't—" "Bring him here," Ethan said. Danny stopped, looked at him. "This ranch has 20 men on it," Ethan said, "and I trust every one of them. Bring Patrick here today. He stays until this is over." Danny was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face, a complicated, unguarded emotion that a man like Danny didn't often let show. "You sure about that?" "I said it," Ethan said, simply, as if the question had already been settled. Danny nodded, picked up his hat. "I'll go now." After he left, Clara and Ethan sat across from each other at the table. "The private ledger," Clara said. "If Patrick can describe it in enough detail, the format, the entries, the specific payments. Briggs can file for a subpoena," Ethan said. "But he needs probable cause. Patrick's testimony provides it. And once Briggs has the ledger—" She leaned forward. "Ethan, that ledger connects Hale to Purvis on multiple cases across multiple counties. That's not a land dispute. That's a criminal conspiracy against multiple property owners." "Federal statute," Ethan said. "Federal statute," she confirmed. "This goes to the U.S. District Court. Territorial court can't touch it. Hale's connections to the local judiciary mean nothing." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something. Before this goes any further. Before you're any further into it." She waited. He looked at the table, then at her, and his voice when he spoke next was the most unguarded she had ever heard it, stripped of the careful, measured control he wore the way other men wore their working clothes. "3 years ago," he said, "Victor Hale approached me, offered to buy the ranch. I refused. 2 months later, a story appeared in the territorial newspaper. It accused me of having forced out a competitor early in my operation, a claim that I'd used financial pressure to drive a smaller rancher out of business." He paused. "It was true, partially." Clara said nothing. The rancher's name was Aldous Finch. He was operating on land that had previously been under a grazing agreement with my father. When the agreement expired, I didn't renew it. Finch had built his operation assuming the renewal was automatic. When it wasn't, he couldn't sustain his herd. Ethan's hands were flat on the table. "I didn't do anything illegal, but I knew what would happen when I let that agreement lapse, and I let it happen anyway." Clara was very still. "I was 26, he said, and I told myself it was business. I told myself he should have secured the agreement properly, and both of those things were true. He looked at her directly. And it was still wrong, because I knew and I did it anyway. The kitchen was very quiet. Why are you telling me this now? Clara said. Because you're about to risk yourself and your father's reputation and your own future to help me fight a man who uses exactly that kind of calculation to justify what he does. He held her gaze. And you deserve to know who you're fighting for. Clara looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Ethan, what you did to Aldous Finch was wrong. You know it was wrong. The fact that you know, and that it's clearly cost you something all these years, is not nothing. She paused. Victor Hale has never once in his life looked at what he's done and called it wrong. That's the difference. She paused again. And you were 26. Have you been a different man since? He was quiet. Yes, he said. Then that's what I'm fighting for, she said. Patrick Rourke arrived that afternoon, a younger, thinner version of Danny, with nervous eyes and hands that couldn't quite settle. Clara brought him inside, sat him at the kitchen table, and put food in front of him, and then she sat across from him with her notebook, and she asked him calmly and methodically everything he knew. He told her everything. The amount of the payment to Purvis, the date, the description of the private ledger, black cover brass clasp kept in the bottom drawer of Hale's personal desk in his home office, not his ranch office. The format of the entries: date, case, name, county, payment, amount, initials. Patrick had seen 4 entries in the brief moment he'd had access to it. 4 entries. 4 cases. 4 families who had lost land or water rights to a man who kept meticulous records of his own crimes with the confidence of someone who had never once expected to be caught. When Patrick finished, Clara closed her notebook and looked at him. You did the right thing, she said. What happens next is going to be difficult, but you'll come through it. Patrick looked at her with the expression of a young man who was frightened and tired and very far out of his depth. How do you know? He said. Because you're not alone, she said. And because the truth is on your side. She paused. Both of those things matter more than people think. She brought the notebook to Ethan, who sent a rider to Helena with a letter for Thomas Briggs, marked urgent. Then she went to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the land. Outside, the ranch was running. The way it always ran, purposeful, steady, the rhythm of men and animals doing the work of the day. From where she stood, it looked like any other afternoon on any other cattle ranch in the Montana Territory. But underneath that surface, something had cracked open. A truth that had been buried in land office files and locked ledgers, and the silence of men who had lost and given up and moved on, was finally moving toward the light. Victor Hale had spent 15 years building a system designed to be invisible. He had never counted on someone being willing to look. He had never counted on Danny Rourke's brother having a conscience, and he had never, in all his careful calculations, accounted for the woman who had arrived at this ranch 6 weeks ago in her mother's dress with no flowers, expecting a cold stranger, and had instead found something she hadn't been looking for. A cause worth fighting for, and a man worth fighting beside. Thomas Briggs arrived at the ranch on a Friday morning, and he didn't come alone. He brought with him a federal marshal named Aldridge, a lean, deliberate man in his 40s who shook hands briefly, said almost nothing, and immediately asked to see every document Clara had assembled. She brought him to the study and laid it all out on the desk in the order she had organized it: the original boundary survey, the Aldous Crane precedent, the Bowman County, filing the letters from 3 additional counties that had arrived in the preceding week, Hale's correspondence to Ethan, her verbatim record of Hale's visit to the porch, and finally her transcript of Patrick Rourke's testimony. Aldridge read through all of it without speaking. It took him 40 minutes. Clara stood at the window and waited. Ethan stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching the marshal read with the particular patience of a man who has learned that some things cannot be hurried. When Aldridge finished, he looked up. "Who organized this?" he said. "I did," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment. "You've built a prosecutorial case file. I've built a record," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." Aldridge looked at Briggs. Briggs gave him the slight nod of a lawyer who had already told him exactly what he was going to find. "The private ledger is the key," Aldridge said. Patrick Rourke's testimony establishes probable cause for a search warrant. If the ledger is where he says it is, and contains what he says it contains, we have a federal fraud and conspiracy case against Hale and the land office clerk both. He set the papers down. I need Rourke to make a formal sworn statement. He's on the property, Ethan said. I'll get him. Aldridge put a hand up. Before you do, I need to be clear about something. He looked at Ethan directly. Once Rourke makes that statement, this moves fast. Hale will know within days, maybe hours, that someone has turned. He has resources, and he has connections, and he'll use both. Are you prepared for that? Ethan didn't hesitate. Yes. Mrs. Callahan. Clara looked at him steadily. Get Patrick, she said. Patrick Rourke gave his sworn statement in the study, with Aldridge Briggs and both Callahans present. His voice shook at the start. Clara poured him water without making it obvious, set it near his hand, and he took it without looking at her. By the time he was 3 minutes into the account, his voice had steadied, not because the fear was gone, but because the telling of a true thing clearly and in order has its own momentum. Truth moves forward on its own weight once you give it room. He described the ledger precisely. The black cover, the brass clasp, the bottom drawer, the 4 entries he had seen, including the one that corresponded directly to Hale's filing against the Callahan Ranch. He described the delivery request, his refusal, the man who had made the request on Hale's behalf. When he finished, Aldridge asked him 3 follow-up questions, then closed his notebook. This is enough, Aldridge said. He looked at Briggs. I can have the warrant by Monday. Monday, Briggs said quietly, as if testing the weight of the word. And the search? Tuesday at the latest. Aldridge stood. I'll need a second marshal and the county sheriff. I want this clean. The county sheriff has a relationship with Hale, Ethan said. Aldridge looked at him. I'm aware. He won't be leading the search. He'll be present as a courtesy to procedure. His voice was flat and final in a way that made clear the sheriff's comfort was not among his priorities. After Aldridge and Briggs left, Patrick sat at the kitchen table, and Danny sat beside him with a hand on his brother's shoulder, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Patrick said, Is this going to work? Ethan looked at him. Yes, he said. No qualification, no hesitation. Patrick nodded slowly, like a man choosing to believe something because the alternative was too heavy to keep carrying. All right, he said. The weekend was the longest Clara could remember, not because nothing happened, but because everything that was going to happen was waiting just past the edge of the visible, and waiting has its own particular weight when the stakes are real. She worked. She always worked when she needed her mind to stay in order. She updated the ranch accounts, wrote 3 letters, reorganized the supply orders for the coming month, and went through the remaining county responses that had arrived in the past week. 2 more cases, 2 more ranchers who had lost land or water rights to Victor Hale by the same method. 6 cases across 5 counties, going back 7 years. She laid them out on the desk in chronological order and looked at them for a long moment. Then she went to find Ethan. He was on the porch, standing at the railing the way he sometimes stood in the evenings, not restless, just present the kind of stillness that belonged to a man who had made peace with the size of what surrounded him. She came to stand beside him, and for a while, neither of them spoke. I've been thinking, she said, about the other ranchers, the ones in the county responses. She paused. When this is over, if Aldridge builds the federal case, they'll be called as witnesses, possibly given the opportunity to reclaim what they lost. She turned to look at him. Did you ever think about that? When you started fighting Hale, not just fighting for your own land, but that the fight might give other people their land back too. Ethan was quiet for a moment. No, he said honestly. At the start I was thinking about survival. And now, he considered the question. Now I'm thinking that a man who does what Hale does counts on people staying separate, stays powerful because each person he hurts thinks they're alone. He paused. The moment they're not alone, the whole thing changes. Clara nodded. That's what I've been thinking too. The silence between them was comfortable in a way it hadn't been 6 weeks ago. Not empty, full in the way that shared purpose fills the space between two people who have stopped being cautious with each other. "Clara," Ethan said. "Yes." He turned to look at her. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way he did most things, as if the movement deserved to be done with intention. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly. Not the way you answer when you're being practical, the actual answer." She held his gaze. "All right. Are you staying because of what we've built here, the case, the operation, the work?" He paused. "Or are you staying because you want to?" The question sat between them like a thing with its own weight. Clara felt something move in her chest. Not the familiar confusion of the first weeks. Not the careful management of her own reactions that she'd been practicing since she arrived. Something simpler. Something she had been refusing to look at directly because she wasn't sure she was ready for what she'd find. "Both," she said. And then because honesty deserved its full measure, and the second one more than the first. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "Good." Just that. One word. But the way he said it, like something he'd been carrying could finally be set down. Said everything the word couldn't hold on its own. Monday came, and with it the warrant. Briggs sent word by mid-morning the federal judge had signed it. Aldridge and his second marshal would execute the search of Hale's property at dawn Tuesday. The county sheriff had been notified as a procedural matter and advised that interference with a federal operation carried its own consequences. Clara read the telegram and felt her pulse shift. She brought it to Ethan and watched him read it with that controlled expression, and then she watched something happen underneath the control. A slow, deep exhale, barely visible, the kind a person releases when they've been holding their breath for years and have finally been given permission to stop. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. They stood there for a moment. "What if the ledger isn't there?" he said. It was the first time he had said the thing she knew he'd been thinking. "Hale wouldn't move it," she said. "Moving it means acknowledging it's a risk. Men like Hale don't think of their own records as vulnerabilities, they think of them as power. Evidence of what they've done and gotten away with." She paused. "It'll be there." "How can you be sure?" "Because Patrick described the clasp as brass and slightly loose," she said. "That's the kind of detail you don't invent. He saw it. It's there." Ethan looked at her. "You've thought about this?" "I've thought about almost nothing else for 4 days," she said. Something crossed his face, warm, brief, real. "You're remarkable," he said, quietly, without performance. Clara felt the words hit somewhere she hadn't guarded against them. "Don't tell me that until it's over," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I'll tell you now," he said, "and again when it's over." Tuesday morning broke cold and gray, and Clara was awake before it did. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs and built up the kitchen fire and made coffee and stood at the window with her cup and waited. Ethan came down 30 minutes later. He poured his own coffee, stood beside her at the window, and they waited together without speaking, because there was nothing left to say that they hadn't already said, and because some moments are simply meant to be stood through side by side without commentary. Danny came in at 7 with the first word. "Aldridge is at Hale's property," he said. "Ryder just came through from town. The search started at first light." Clara set her cup down. They waited. At 9:15 Briggs arrived in person. He tied his horse at the post, came up the porch steps, and when he came through the door, his expression was the careful, professionally composed expression of a lawyer who has learned to manage his reactions before delivering important news. But underneath it, Clara could see it. The thing he was trying not to show until he'd said the words properly. "The ledger was in this bottom drawer," he said. "Brass clasp, black cover, exactly where Patrick said." The kitchen went very quiet. "And," Ethan said. 11 entries, Briggs said. 11 separate payments to Purvis at the Helena Land Office corresponding to 11 separate filing irregularities across 6 counties, going back 9 years. He set his bag on the table and opened it. Aldridge also found a secondary set of documents, correspondence between Hale and a territorial government clerk, regarding the land boundary definitions used in the original survey filings. The clerk has already been taken into federal custody. Patrick, who had come into the kitchen silently at some point during this, made a sound that was barely audible, something between a breath and a word. 11 cases, Clara said. 11? Briggs confirmed. She looked at Ethan. His face was still, but his eyes were not. There was something moving in them that she had never seen before, something that looked like a man experiencing relief so profound it had nowhere to go but inward. "What happens to Hale?" Ethan said. "How was taken into custody this morning," Briggs said. "Federal charges. Fraud, conspiracy, corruption of a government official. His lawyer is already in Helena, but—" Briggs paused. "There are 11 cases and a private ledger written in his own hand. His lawyer's going to earn his fee." Danny let out a long breath from his corner of the kitchen. Patrick said very quietly, "It's over." "The arrest is made," Briggs said carefully. "The legal process takes time, but the evidence is overwhelming. Yes." He looked at Patrick directly. "You did the right thing. The federal court will recognize that." Patrick put his head down on his hands on the table. Danny reached over and put a hand on the back of his brother's neck, briefly, the way brothers do when words are insufficient. The town knew by afternoon. News in a place like Millhaven travels the way fire travels in dry grass, fast in all directions, with a particular quality of heat that changes everything it touches. By the time the sun started dropping toward the western ridge, Clara could feel the shift in the air when she rode into town for a supply order that afternoon, the way people looked at her and at the ranch wagon and said things they hadn't said before. Mrs. Hartley from the dry goods store came out to the boardwalk without being asked. "Is it true?" she said. "Victor Hale." "The federal marshal made an arrest this morning," Clara said. Mrs. Hartley pressed her hand to her mouth. Then she said, "My brother sold his grazing rights to Hale 3 years ago for half what they were worth. He thought there was no other option. He may have the opportunity to pursue a claim," Clara said. "There will be a federal process. Your brother should speak to a lawyer." Mrs. Hartley looked at her with an expression Clara recognized, the specific expression of someone who has been carrying a weight they'd accepted as permanent and have just been told it might be put down. "Tell your husband," Mrs. Hartley said, "that we've all been wrong about him." Clara held her gaze. "I'll tell him," she said. "But I think the more important thing is that you tell him yourself." Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly. Clara finished her supply order and drove back to the ranch, and the whole way back, she was thinking about what May had said in those first days, about how the town had whispered about Ethan for years, how his silence had been read as cruelty, how the reputation that preceded him into every room had been built from fear and misunderstanding and the deliberate efforts of a man who had needed Ethan to look dangerous so that his own predations could look justified. Victor Hale had used Ethan's reputation as cover, had cultivated the town's fear of the silent wolf to ensure that when Hale moved against him, the town would stay out of it, would decide it was a dispute between two powerful men and none of their business. What he hadn't counted on was a woman who had arrived at this ranch with no preconceptions left to protect, who had already decided to walk into her life with her eyes open, and who had looked at the man behind the silence and seen exactly what was there. That evening, Ethan found her in the study. She was at the desk, but she wasn't working. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and the lamp turned low, and she was thinking the kind of thinking that happens when a long fight is finally over and the mind doesn't quite know what to do with the space that's been freed up. He came in without knocking, which he had stopped doing 2 weeks ago. Set a cup of tea on the corner of the desk, the way she sometimes set his coffee. Then he stood there not quite sure what to do with his hands, which was so unlike him that Clara almost smiled. "You went to town," he said. "Supply order. Mrs. Hartley stopped you." "She did." Clara picked up the tea. "She said the town has been wrong about you." Ethan said nothing. "She's right," Clara said. "They have been." She paused. "But Ethan, some of the way they saw you was Hale's work. He needed you to look dangerous. He cultivated it." He sat down across from her, slowly, like a man lowering himself into a chair he isn't sure will hold. "I know," he said. "I figured that out about 2 years in. By then the reputation had its own momentum." He looked at his hands. It was also easier. People keeping their distance meant people not trying to get close enough to hurt what I was protecting. The ranch, she said. The ranch, the men, May. He looked up. Everything I had. Clara held his gaze. That's not a life, Ethan. That's a fortress. He was quiet for a long moment. I know that too, he said. Now. The word now sat between them, with everything it implied. Clara set her tea down. She had been avoiding the next thing for weeks, not because she didn't know what it was, but because she'd been waiting until she was certain. Until the feeling was real, and not just the product of shared crisis and proximity, and the particular intensity of fighting for something together. She was certain now. I didn't come here expecting to feel anything, she said. Her voice was level. I came here because I had no other option, and because I'd decided that survival was enough. That building something practical and functional was enough. Ethan was very still. It's not enough, she said. Not anymore. Clara, let me finish. She looked at him. I watch you with the ranch hands, and I see how carefully you protect the people who depend on you. I watch you make decisions, and I see a man who chooses principle over convenience every single time, even when it costs him. I watched you tell me about Aldous Finch when you didn't have to, when the truth could only make things harder, and I understood in that moment that you are one of the most honest people I have ever known. She paused. And I am not willing to keep pretending that those things haven't changed something. The silence that followed was the most complete silence she had ever experienced in that house. Ethan looked at her with an expression she had no precedent for open, in a way she had never seen his face. Be open exposed in a way that clearly cost him, because openness cost him more than it cost. Most people had always cost him more, and he was paying it anyway. I built this ranch, he said slowly, believing that the land was the thing, that if I kept the land, I kept everything that mattered. He paused. I was wrong. He looked at her steadily. The land is the land. What matters is who you build it with. Clara felt the words move through her the way true things move, not with drama, but with weight, the particular gravity of something real. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know, he said. And then, because he was Ethan, and directness was his native language, I don't want you to. May made a dinner that night that nobody had asked her to make a full spread, the kind that appears on tables when someone in a household is celebrating something they haven't entirely put into words yet. She put it on the table and called everyone in and didn't say a word about why. And if her eyes were slightly brighter than usual when she looked between Ethan and Clara, she kept that to herself with the skilled privacy of a woman who had watched this house for a long time and had hoped quietly and without ever saying so for exactly this. Danny and Patrick ate at the table with them. Briggs had gone back to Helena. Aldridge was managing the federal proceedings. The immediate crisis was over, and in its place was something neither Ethan nor Clara had quite had time to notice growing alongside everything else, a warmth in the house that hadn't been there before, a feeling of people who belonged in the same space. Patrick, for the first time since arriving, ate without looking over his shoulder. Danny caught Clara's eye across the table at one point, and gave her a look, brief, warm, approving, that said everything he wasn't going to put into words in front of his employer. She held his gaze for a moment and gave him the smallest nod. After dinner, after everyone had drifted back to their respective corners of the evening, Clara found herself alone on the porch. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes stars look closer than they are, and she stood with her arms wrapped around herself and looked out at the land she had spent 6 weeks learning. She heard the door behind her and knew without turning who it was. Ethan came to stand beside her. He was holding her coat, which she had left on the hook inside. He put it over her shoulders without comment, without making it a gesture the way he did small kind things, as if they were simply the next logical action requiring no ceremony. She pulled the coat around her. "Thank you," she said. "You're cold," he said. "I know." She leaned against the railing. "Ethan, when you married me, when you agreed to the arrangement with my father, what did you actually expect?" He was quiet for a moment. "Competence," he said. "Someone capable. Someone who wouldn't be unhappy here." He paused. I expected to do my best by someone who deserved better circumstances than the ones she'd been handed. I expected to be fair, and to keep my promises, and to build something workable. And instead, he turned to look at her. Instead, he said, I got someone who walked into my study and rearranged my accounting system in 4 days, found a buried land survey in 6, and built a federal prosecution case in 6 weeks. The corner of his mouth moved. I got someone who stood on this porch and faced Victor Hale without flinching, who sat across from me and told me the truth about Aldous Finch at a moment when most people would have let it go. He paused. I got more than I expected, in every direction. Clara looked at him. So did I, she said quietly. The night stretched out around them wide and dark and full of the particular peace that follows a long fight, when the right side has finally genuinely won. The land that had been under threat was still here. The men who worked it were inside, fed and safe. The case that would protect not just this ranch, but 11 other families was in federal hands. And standing on this porch in the cold, clear Montana night was a man who had spent years being afraid that getting close to anything would only give the world another way to hurt him, and a woman who had arrived afraid of exactly that same man, and somewhere in the 6 weeks between a signed certificate in a county clerk's office and this moment they had both stopped being afraid. Not because the world had gotten safer, because they had stopped facing it alone. Clara didn't say any of that out loud. She didn't need to. She simply stood beside him in the cold, and he stood beside her, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need filling because it's already full. The federal hearing was set for the 3rd week of October. Thomas Briggs came to the ranch 8 days before the date, with a folder thick enough to anchor a wagon and a look on his face that Clara had learned to read the controlled, forward-leaning energy of a lawyer who knows he has what he needs and is simply waiting for the room where he gets to use it. He sat at the kitchen table and went through the case point by point. 11 documented instances of fraudulent survey filings. The private ledger in Hale's own handwriting. The testimony of the Helena Land Office clerk Purvis, who had accepted a plea arrangement in exchange for full cooperation and had spent 3 days telling federal investigators everything he knew. Patrick Rourke's sworn statement. The independent surveyor's authentication of the original Callahan boundary documents. The letters from 6 counties. The testimony of 4 surviving ranchers who had lost land to Hale's scheme and had agreed when Ethan wrote to them personally to come forward. 4 ranchers, Ethan said. I thought we had 3 confirmed. Silas Webb changed his mind, Briggs said. He called my office 2 days ago. Said he'd spent 20 years being angry and ashamed, and he decided he was done being ashamed of something that wasn't his fault. Clara felt something tighten in her throat. She looked at the table. Good, Ethan said quietly. Good for him. There's one more thing, Briggs said. He pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the folder and set it on the table. Hale's legal team made a final offer yesterday. He'll plead to 2 counts of fraud, forfeit the contested land parcels, pay restitution to 3 of the affected ranchers, and serve 18 months. He paused. They want to avoid the full federal hearing. The kitchen went very still. Clara looked at Ethan. I was looking at the sheet of paper, not picking it up, just looking at it. What do you want to do? She said. He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Briggs shifted slightly in his chair. Then Ethan said, What happens to the other 8 cases if he pleads to 2? Briggs was careful. They become civil matters. The affected families can sue, but without the criminal conviction as foundation, the cases are significantly harder. So 8 families get nothing guaranteed, Ethan said. In practical terms, yes. Then no, Ethan said. He pushed the sheet back across the table toward Briggs. We go to the hearing. Briggs picked up the paper, folded it, placed it back in his folder with the efficient movements of a man who had expected exactly this answer. I'll notify the court. After Briggs left, Clara looked at Ethan across the table. You know a trial is unpredictable, she said. Not a challenge, just the truth between them. I know, he said. But those 8 families didn't come forward to get nothing. He held her gaze. If I take the deal, I protect myself and leave them without a foundation. That's not something I'm willing to do. Clara nodded slowly. Neither am I, she said. The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the particular language of old timber in cold weather, and she went through the case in her mind, the way she had gone through it 100 times, looking for the gap. The thing she'd missed, the vulnerability she hadn't seen. She found nothing she hadn't already found. The case was as solid as 6 weeks of relentless work could make it. And yet, she got up at 2 in the morning and went downstairs. The kitchen fire had burned low, and she built it back up and put the kettle on, and she was standing at the counter waiting for it when she heard the study door. Ethan came into this kitchen. He took one look at her and went directly to the cabinet for a second cup. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. "No." He set the cup beside hers and leaned against the counter. "What are you thinking about?" "Silas Webb," she said. "Whether he'll hold up in the room. He's been carrying this for 20 years. That's a long time to hold something and then be asked to put it down in front of a federal judge." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He'll hold." "How do you know?" "Because I wrote to him," Ethan said. "Not a formal letter, a personal one. I told him what happened to my father. The shame of watching someone use paper and law to make an honest man feel like a criminal." He paused. He wrote back, 3 pages. Said my father's story sounded exactly like his own. He looked at Clara. "Men like Silas Webb don't break in the room. They've been broken already and put themselves back together. The room is just where they finally get to say it out loud." Clara looked at him. "You never told me you wrote to him personally." "You had enough to manage." "Ethan." "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. He needed to know he wasn't alone in it. The kettle began to sound. Clara poured the water and handed him his cup, and they stood together at the counter, and the kitchen was warm, and the night outside was very cold, and the morning was coming whether they were ready for it or not. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Clara said, "I want you to know something." He looked at her. "I'm proud of what we built here," she said. "Not the case, not the legal strategy. The fact that 11 families are going to walk into that room because someone finally chose not to look away." She held his gaze. "You chose that. When you turned down the plea deal. When you wrote to Silas Webb. When you brought Patrick Rourke into this house and told him he was safe." She paused. "That's who you are. And I want you to walk into that room tomorrow knowing that I see it. All of it." Ethan set his cup down on the counter. He turned to face her fully, and what was on his face in that moment was not the controlled, measured expression she had spent weeks learning to read beneath. It was the thing beneath the face of a man who had been alone for so long that being truly seen by another person still carried a quality of shock, even when he'd had weeks to get used to the idea that it was happening. He reached out and took her hand. Carefully. The way he did everything with intention and without performance. "I know," he said quietly. "Because of you, I know." The federal hearing convened in Helena on a gray October morning. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. Briggs sat at the table with Ethan, his folders arranged with military precision. Clara sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind them, and she had brought her notebook, not because she planned to use it, but because holding it steadied her. Behind her sat Danny Rourke and his brother Patrick, who had been formally recognized as a federal witness and wore the expression of a man who has done a frightening thing and is still slightly astonished to be on the other side of it. Behind them sat the 4 ranchers who had come from their respective counties to give testimony. Silas Webb among them. A weathered man in his 60s who caught Clara's eye when he came in and gave her a brief, firm nod that said everything his face was too composed to show. Victor Hale sat at the opposite table with 2 lawyers and the bearing of a man who still believed the room could be managed. He had dressed carefully. He sat straight. He did not look at Ethan. Clara watched him and thought he still thinks he can win this. Not the case. The room. The impression. He still thinks that how he carries himself will matter more than what's written in that ledger. She opened her notebook and wrote nothing. Just held it. The federal judge was a woman named Honorable Margaret Crow, which Clara had not expected, and which clearly Hale had not expected either, based on the brief, rapidly concealed recalculation that crossed his face when she entered. Judge Crow was in her 50s, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been listened to for so long they no longer need to fill space with gesture. She sat. She reviewed the file in front of her. She looked up. "We'll begin," she said.
Done.
Briggs opened with the ledger. He didn't describe it. He produced it, the original logged into evidence placed on the clerk's table where the judge could examine it directly. 11 entries, 9 years, 6 counties. He read each entry aloud, the date, the case name, the county, the payment amount, the initials beside each line that matched the handwriting samples the federal investigators had obtained. The courtroom was very quiet. When Briggs finished reading the last entry, Callahan v. Hale, September 1878, Helena Land Office, $40 MP. He set the ledger down and turned to face the judge. "The prosecution rests on the documentary record alone," he said. "But we have asked 4 witnesses to speak today, not because the ledger requires support, because the people it represents deserve to be heard." Judge Crow looked at him for a moment. "Call your first witness," she said. Silas Webb took the stand and did not break. He told his story in a flat, measured voice that was more devastating than any amount of emotion could have been, the dry, factual account of a man who has distilled 20 years of loss and anger into its essential truth. The survey filing. The boundary claim. The months of legal proceedings he couldn't afford to sustain. The day he signed the sale papers for half the value of land his father had homesteaded. The drive away from the property he had worked his entire adult life with, his wife in the seat beside him and his youngest son asleep in the wagon bed. He stopped there, just for a moment. His jaw worked once. Then he said, "I want the record to show that my father built that land, and Victor Hale stole it with a pen." Hale's lawyer objected to the characterization. Judge Crow overruled it without looking up from her notes. When Silas Webb stepped down, he walked past the plaintiff's table without looking at Hale. He sat back down in the gallery, and Clara watched him settle into his chair and close his eyes briefly, and she understood that he had been waiting 20 years for that moment. Not for revenge, not for drama, but simply to say the true thing in a room with the authority to record it. She reached back and put her hand briefly on his arm. He covered it with his own hand for just a second. Then they both turned back to the front. Patrick Rourke gave his testimony in 12 precise minutes. He described the ledger, the delivery request, his refusal, and the conversation with Danny. He was nervous, she could see it in the slight rigidity of his posture, but his voice was steady, and his answers were exact. And when Hale's lawyer attempted to suggest that his account was motivated by a personal grievance against his former employer, Patrick looked at the man with a clarity that was more effective than any prepared response. "I had no grievance," he said. "I had a conscience." One of the ranchers in the gallery made a sound that was almost a laugh. Judge Crow's expression didn't change, but something in it suggested she was not entirely unmoved. Hale's lawyer sat down. Briggs did not re-examine. He simply nodded at Patrick and said, "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. That's all." Ethan was the final witness. He took the stand with the same unhurried calm with which he did everything, and Clara watched the courtroom watch him, the particular attention that attaches to a person whose reputation has preceded them into a room. She could feel it, the curiosity, the reassessment happening in real time. Briggs asked him to describe the progression of Hale's actions against his ranch. Ethan did so methodically. The initial offers, the refusals, the canceled supply contracts, the survey, filing the personal visit to the ranch, the attempts to isolate his operation. He spoke without embellishment and without heat, and Clara understood that this was more effective than either would have been. A man recounting what was done to him with absolute precision because he doesn't need to inflate it. The facts are sufficient. Then Briggs asked, "Mr. Callahan, what motivated you to refuse the plea arrangement that would have resolved this matter in your favor?" The courtroom was very still. Ethan looked at the judge rather than at Briggs when he answered. "Because there were 11 families in those files," he said. "And I wasn't willing to walk out of this with my land intact while they walked out with nothing." He paused. "I've spent most of my life being told I'm a hard man, A cold man. A man who puts his operation above everything else. Another pause. I don't want that to be the last true thing said about me. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Judge Crow wrote something in her notes. Hale's lawyer stood and approached. He was good, Clara could see that. He was calm and methodical, and he had clearly prepared for this. Mr. Callahan, he said, isn't it true that earlier in your career you allowed a grazing agreement to lapse, knowing the impact it would have on a smaller operator named Aldous Finch? The room shifted slightly. Clara's hands tightened on her notebook. Ethan looked at the lawyer without flinching. Yes, he said. A pause in the room. And isn't it true that Finch lost his operation as a result? Yes. So by your own admission you have used the terms of a business agreement to harm a competitor. Ethan was quiet for exactly one beat. I have, he said. And I've carried that for 15 years. What I did to Aldous Finch was legal. It was also wrong. His voice was level and absolute. The difference between what I did and what Victor Hale has done for 9 years is the difference between a mistake a young man made and a system a grown man designed and refined and executed against 11 families with a ledger that he maintained himself. He looked at the lawyer directly. One of those things I can't undo. The other one I came here to stop. The lawyer looked at him for a moment. Then he said, no further questions, and sat down. Judge Crow delivered her ruling the following morning. She did not take long. She had reviewed the documentary evidence overnight, she said, and found it sufficient to establish the charges on all 11 counts without ambiguity. Victor Hale was convicted on 11 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and corruption of a government official. The clerk Purvis, under his plea arrangement, received 18 months and a permanent bar from any government employment. Hale's sentence would be determined at a separate proceeding. But the judge stated clearly that the scope of the conspiracy, 9 years, 6 counties, 11 families, would factor significantly into her consideration. She also issued an order directing the Federal Land Office to review all boundary surveys submitted by Hale or his agents in the past decade, and to restore contested parcels to their original owners wherever the record supported it. 11 families. Clara sat in the gallery and listened to Judge Crow read the order, and felt the words move through her, the way deep things move not with noise, but with the particular resonance of something that matters. Briggs was shaking Ethan's hand. Danny was standing, and so was Patrick, and Patrick's face had done something it probably hadn't done in months. It had relaxed entirely, the guarded tension gone, replaced by something open and young and deeply relieved. Silas Webb was sitting 2 seats down from Clara, very still, with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap, and she could not see his face clearly, but she could see the slight movement in his shoulders that told her enough. She looked at Ethan. He had turned from Briggs and was looking at her, across the room. Through the motion and the noise and the specific relief of a morning when justice has been formally documentably delivered. He looked at her the way she had looked at that first survey, like a thing finally in his hands after a long time of reaching. She held his gaze and gave him the smallest nod. He gave her one back. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, just the two of them, the way they had driven out from the wedding in June. Same wagon, same road, same open sky. But nothing else was the same, and they both knew it without having to say it. Clara watched the land go by and thought about the woman who had made this drive the first time with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up and her heart deliberately closed, telling herself that survival was enough, that practical tolerance was enough, that she could build a life out of competence and function and not need anything as uncertain as feeling. She had been wrong about so many things. What happens now, she said, with the ranch, with everything? Ethan considered the question for a moment. The wagon wheels turned, the road stretched. The North Pasture water rights are confirmed, he said. We expand the herd next spring. I've been holding back because of the uncertainty. With the boundary secure, we can run another 200 head on the eastern range. He paused. Briggs thinks the restitution order may restore part of what Hale collected from the other ranchers. The federal process takes time, but it'll happen. That's the ranch, Clara said. He glanced at her. He knew what she was asking. I want to build a schoolhouse, he said, on the eastern edge of the property. The ranch hand's children are riding 4 miles to the nearest school. It's not good enough. Clara turned to look at him. A schoolhouse. May mentioned it 6 months ago, and I told her we didn't have the resources. He kept his eyes on the road. We do now. Ethan. She kept her voice steady. That's not an answer to what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know. He paused. I'm not good at this part. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. You're better than you think, she said. I want you to stay, he said, simply, directly, without preamble. Not because of the ranch, not because of the accounts or the legal strategy or any of the practical reasons. Because this house is a different place than it was in June, and that is entirely because of you. Because I am a different man than I was in June. He paused. And I don't want to go back. Clara looked at the road ahead of them for a moment. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I told you that. I know. I wanted to say it anyway. Another pause. I want to say things. I've been quiet for so long that I've gotten in the habit of not saying things I should say. I'm going to try to be better at that. Clara felt something in her chest do a complicated warm thing that she didn't try to manage or contain. You're doing fine right now, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Good, he said. They drove the rest of the way home in the best kind of silence, earned and easy and full. The months that followed were the ones that built the real story, not the dramatic story of ledgers and federal hearings, and a man brought to account, but the quieter, deeper story of two people learning each other in the everyday. Clara took over the full ranch accounts and expanded them a proper bookkeeping system that tracked seasonal variance labor costs, feed pricing, and projected revenue 3 quarters out. She wrote to a seed merchant in St. Louis about diversifying the fodder crops to reduce price vulnerability. She rewrote the supplier contracts with clauses that Hale's disruption tactics would have found considerably harder to exploit. Ethan built the schoolhouse. It took 6 weeks and the labor of every man on the ranch who could spare the time, and when it was finished, May organized a community gathering that brought people out from Millhaven and 3 surrounding properties. People who had never set foot on the Callahan Ranch before, who came with their children and their neighbors and their own versions of everything they'd heard about the Silent Wolf, and left with something different. Mrs. Hartley came. She brought her brother, the one who had sold his grazing rights, and she introduced him to Ethan herself, standing at the door of the new schoolhouse, with the direct, slightly emotional manner of someone fulfilling a promise they'd made to themselves. My brother has something to say to you, she said to Ethan. Ethan looked at the man, waited. The brother, a quiet man in his 50s named Gerald, with rough hands and steady eyes, said, I heard what you did, refusing the plea, including the rest of us. He stopped. I don't have words for that. Ethan said, you would have done the same. Gerald looked at him for a moment. I'd like to think so, he said. I'm not sure I would have. Ethan held out his hand. Gerald shook it. That was all. But Clara, standing near enough to witness it, understood that it was not a small thing. It was the specific moment a reputation ends and a truth begins. The moment when the story a community tells about a person finally catches up with who that person actually is. In the spring, a letter arrived from Silas Webb. Clara recognized the handwriting from the 3-page letter he'd sent Ethan before the hearing. She brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Ethan at breakfast. He opened it, read it, set it down. What does he say? She said. The land order came through, Ethan said. The federal office restored his eastern pasture 60 acres. He paused. He says he's going to run cattle on it this summer, first cattle on that land in 3 years. Another pause. He says he named the section. Named it what? Ethan looked up at her. Callahan pasture, he said quietly. Clara sat down. He didn't have to do that, she said. No, Ethan said. Are you going to write back? Yes. He folded the letter carefully. I'm going to tell him I'm honored, and that he should rename it something that belongs to his own family, because that land is his. He paused. And it should carry his name. Clara looked at him across the table. This man who had spent years allowing himself to be defined by other people's fear of him, who had carried the weight of a reputation he hadn't entirely earned and hadn't known how to dispute. And she thought about the 22-year-old boy who had watched dishonest men use paper to shame his father, and had decided the only safe thing was to feel as little as possible and show even less. She thought about what it takes to choose differently. To decide at some point in the long middle of a difficult life that the fortress you've built around yourself is no longer protection, that it's just a wall between you and everything worth having. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Write the letter," she said. "And then come help me with the spring accounts. I've found 3 places where we're overpaying the feed supplier, and I want your eyes on the contracts before I renegotiate." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one she loved best, the one that only appeared when she'd said something that surprised him by being both completely practical and completely right at the same time. "All right," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly the same way he'd taken her hand off the wagon 6 months ago. Deliberate and warm and without performance. And then he stood up, picked up the letter, and went to write his answer. Chemeg. Summer came back to the valley, the way it always did, wide and hot, and full of the particular vitality of land that has been well kept. The herd had grown. The schoolhouse had 12 children in it 3 days a week. Danny Rourke had made foreman officially a title he'd held in practice for 2 years and received with the same easy, genuine manner with which he received everything. Patrick had stayed on at the ranch through the winter and was still there working the east fence line with a steadiness that had grown in him since October, like something that had been waiting for the right conditions. Clara stood on the porch one evening in late June, with Ethan beside her, watching the day go down over the land, the same land that had been threatened and protected and fought for and won. And she thought about all the versions of this moment she hadn't been able to imagine on the morning she'd walked into a county clerk's office in her mother's dress with no flowers and no expectation of anything beyond survival. She had been so certain that survival was the ceiling, that a life could be managed and functional and sufficient without being anything more. She had never been so glad to be wrong. "Do you remember," she said, "the first thing you said to me in the county clerk's office?" Ethan thought for a moment. "I said, which rumors?" "You did." She looked at him. "I thought it was the most evasive answer I'd ever heard." "It wasn't evasion," he said. "There were a lot of rumors. I needed to know which ones specifically concerned you." "I know that now," she said. And some of them were true," she said. "You were cold. You were closed. You were impossible to read." She paused. "And underneath all of it was the most principled, most quietly generous person I have ever known, who just needed someone to stay in the room long enough to see it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Most people didn't want to," he said. "Most people were afraid of you," she said. "I was too, for about a week." She held his gaze. "Then I saw you reset a fence post with an old man who couldn't do it himself, and I started having considerably more trouble maintaining the fear." His expression shifted genuinely warmly fully, the kind of shift she had spent 6 months earning the right to see. "1 fence post," he said. "1 fence post," she confirmed. He looked out at the land for a moment. Then he said, "I was afraid of you too, for longer than a week." She raised an eyebrow. "Of me." "Of what you could see," he said simply. "Most people couldn't see past the reputation. You could see past it on day 3. That was—" He paused, searching for the word with the careful attention he gave to words, "terrifying." Clara laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, the kind that comes from the chest. And Ethan, the man who had spent years being called the silent wolf, the cold, ruthless, impossible-to-understand cowboy that everyone in Millhaven had feared, smiled. Fully. Without armor. It was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. The Callahan Ranch endured. Not because the land was good, though it was. Not because the cattle operation was sound, though Clara had made it sounder than it had ever been. Not because a federal court had confirmed its boundaries and restored its water rights, though all of that was true. It endured because of what had been built inside it, the particular unbreakable thing that grows between two people when they have chosen each other, not from obligation or fear or the absence of alternatives, but from clear-eyed knowledge of exactly who the other person is in full. The man who had been feared became the man who was trusted. The woman who had arrived with nothing but her capability and her determination became the foundation of a home that had never fully understood what that word meant before she walked into it. And the marriage that had begun in a county clerk's office with a stranger's signature beside her own became slowly, honestly, permanently the best decision either of them had ever made. Not because it had been easy, because they had been willing. And in the end, that willingness, that daily, unglamorous, profoundly human choice, to stay in the room and see each other clearly, and keep choosing, was the only love story that had ever mattered. It was enough. It was everything.